A reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. May God bless us with this reading of this word. Well, good morning, church. Wasn't that beautiful? Oh, what a great way to begin the season. So I want to share with you our theme for the Advent season. Our theme for the Advent season is A Weary World Rejoices. We're going to be asking the question, how can a weary world rejoice? How do we rejoice in the midst of our weariness? And it comes from that great hymn that we hear every year, O Holy Night, that's beloved by the church. O Holy Night is performed every year faithfully here at our church by Todd Maxwell on Christmas Eve. And it's a standing tradition in churches all around the world. And that theme, A Weary World Rejoices, comes from that one line in the hymn where it says, a thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices. Now, did you know that O Holy Night was written by a French poet? The lyrics were written by a French poet who was also an atheist. And the music was supplied by a Jewish composer. Did you know that the first broadcast, live musical broadcast ever in the history of the world was a performance of this song? A Canadian inventor in 1906 on Christmas Eve took out his violin on his little broadcast station and played O Holy Night and then sang the last verse and then read from the Gospel of Luke. As I was thinking about the Advent season and I was listening to this hymn, there was this one word that just jumped out at me in that phrase, a thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices. And it's a word that I think really describes where a lot of people are in the world at this time, maybe a lot of the time, and it's the word weary. Weary. Because everywhere I look, I see weary people. People carrying a weariness in their body and in their soul. Weariness is being exhausted in your strength, being exhausted in your endurance, tolerance, and patience. Weariness is when we are reluctant to carry something on because we're just fatigued and worn down. Weariness is what happens to us when we pray for the world to be different again and again and again, and for something to be different than it is, but it isn't, and it appears our prayers are not answered, and we see no answer. There's a psychotherapist and also a grief counselor. Her name is Megan Devine, and she wrote this statement. I just think it's true. I believe it. It is truth. That there are some things in life, she says, there are some things in life that cannot be fixed. We just learn how to carry them. Raise your hand if it's true. Some things in life that cannot be fixed, we just learn how to carry them. And it's the things that we carry year after year that weary us. The state of the world we're living in, the meanness, the cruelty, polarization, the complexities. Our own personal lives, our relationships sometimes which are fraying and difficult, our physical health, our mental struggles, just the over-busy scheduled lives we have, the grief that we sometimes carry in our lives. And the reality is we also know this to be true. We also know that for the things that we carry, there are a lot of people in the world who carry even more than we do. Just the other day, I saw just a really sad scene. Here were two people who obviously have no place to go at night, who are obviously without homes, and they were standing in front of me, and one man was leaning, a full-grown adult man was leaning over on another man, crying on his shoulder. It was a cold day. And I can only imagine what he's crying about. One of the causes of homelessness, so many different causes, but one of the real tragedies of homelessness is a different kind of poverty that we don't know. It's a relational poverty. Many of those who live on the streets don't have the social networks and the relationships that we have that would keep us from being in that situation. And so we see weariness all around us. We see it in those who are battling addictions, those who are longtime caregivers for family members. We see it in those who are enduring round after round after round of chemotherapy with no assurance of going into remission. And then we see it at this time of year. Just look around. The people who at this time of year kind of carry a heaviness in heart that produces a weariness that comes from our grief of living life and doing life without someone that we love and that's not with us. I just became familiar with an author, a young author by the name of Kate Bowler, and she's written some really good books. She wrote one, it goes like this: everything happens for a reason, and other lies that I believed. She's also written the book that I'm reading right now, which is called No Cure for Being Human. She's a Duke Divinity School scholar. She teaches at Duke. She's done a lot of research on contemporary American evangelical religion and in particular the prosperity gospel. But at the age of 35, and this is what the book is about, her experience, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer with a 3-year-old son and a promising career. And the book is her memoir talking about her experience and how she went from being a person who her whole life was planned, she had it all planned out what she was going to do, until life showed her what it had planned for her. And I love this quote. She says, before the baby, before the diagnosis, before the pandemic, before when I was ignorant, I thought my life was a series of choices. I created my own life until one day I couldn't. I'd accepted the burden of limitless choices only to find out I had few to make. It's true, isn't it? She goes on to say, this is what happens to all of us. We fall ill, we get old, we can't have that baby or keep that relationship. We missed our chance to go to this school or go to that school. Our parents die before we know them, and our kids forget we love them or they loved us. And we lose people, she says, before we learn how to live, without them. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. I'm thinking it too. Gee, this is awfully dark. Can't we talk about something else? Can't we just sort of push this weariness aside and sing joy to the world and pretend like nothing's happening in the world around us and just sort of put on happy? Well, we could do that. But then January 1 rolls around and we're back to the same old things that weary us. And the reality is that Advent as a season has darker tones attached to it. That's why the O come, Emmanuel, it's not bright and cheery. It has a darker emotional tone to it because Advent is about longing. It's about being between this world and the next. It's about hoping for something to be different than it is. And when you read in the first 2 chapters of Luke's gospel, you don't see people, what you see are people who are weary, tired, waiting. Zechariah, Elizabeth, Mary, Joseph, shepherds, A whole world waiting on a Messiah to come to make the world right, and they're weary, and they're exhausted, and they're tired. So it occurs to me in this Advent season that maybe it's not unfaithful to acknowledge what makes us tired. Maybe it's actually the faithful thing to do, to believe that God meets us in the places where we're weary and tired, as we see in the story. So let me ask you a really good question. As this Advent begins, what weariness are you carrying in your body and your soul? Now, the Gospel of Luke opens up with the story of an older couple, Zachariah and Elizabeth, who were very weary. And the very first line in the Gospel itself, and the story is, in the time of Herod the king. I mean, we think that's kind of like biblical filler material, you know. But actually it means something, because for the people who lived in the world, that name struck terror in the hearts of people, and they were wearied by his rule. He was a bloodthirsty sociopath who killed anyone that got in his way without discrimination, family members. And he ruled with an iron fist, and people in that culture lived in a climate of fear. And on top of that general overall concern for the world they were living in, Zachariah and Elizabeth were older, and the Scripture tells us that they were righteous people. It tells us that they came from a family of priests, and it says that they did everything the right way. They were blameless. You know what that means in our terms? Let me put it in more contemporary language. It means they came every Sunday. It means they filled out a pledge card. It means they volunteered for the youth group. It means that at the potlucks they brought meat. They didn't just bring peas. And on Christmas Eve, after all the wax was dripped onto the chairs, they stayed late, and everybody went home and cleaned off the wax. That's who they were. They're a good couple. But the weary thing for this couple was this, that in spite of all their do-gooding, they were without children. And it's heartbreaking for anyone that wants children, who long for it and don't have children, and we feel that. But in that culture, it was a stigma attached to it, because in that culture it meant that maybe they weren't living God's way. Maybe God somehow or another wasn't blessing them. Maybe they'd done something wrong, and so they could hear the whispers. But here's the truth I know about this story, is I know this about weariness, that sometimes the weariest people are those who do their very best, and do their very best, and do their very best, and show up and clean the wax up off the chairs, and yet things don't turn out the way they hope. Some of the most faithful people are the most weary people. Did you know that Mother Teresa, for example, who served the poor diligently and faithfully and obediently, decade after decade, in some of the poorest parts of the world, among the most difficult situations we could ever imagine or hope for, that she lived for years and years with kind of a darkness in her soul and a depressance, a spiritual emptiness. After she died, they published some of her journals, and we found out that she lived a long time feeling this profound absence of God, yet she continued to do her work. And you read her diary and you realize that Mother Teresa was this very weary soul. So don't be confused. As you look around and you see people doing all the good and the right things, sometimes they're just hiding it, because down deep inside there's a weariness in there for doing things and hoping life will be different, but it just turns out the same year after year after year after year. Now, as it would have it, Zechariah, as a priest, belonged to this priestly division, and they would go 2 or 3 times a year up to Jerusalem, where they would help serve the temple with the sacrifices and the burning of the incense. And if you happened to be chosen for the burning of the incense, they would do lots. And if you were chosen to burn the incense, in the temple, it was a great honor. There were thousands of priests, and you might go your whole lifetime and never get to serve. And here is, late in life, a life of disappointment, he gets this one honor. And Zechariah is invited to go into the temple. The people stay behind and pray while he goes into this one place and goes there by himself and burns the incense. Surely he knew the sacredness of the moment. Who couldn't? Because lighting the incense, as the smoke rose into the air and the aroma, they represented the prayers of the people before God. And here was Zechariah in this moment, intense moment, lighting these prayers and in a sense being an intermediary between God and the people. But the last thing he expected was to actually encounter God there. I know that's how it is because that's what weariness does to us. After a while, after disappointment, we get this weary sort of soul, and even very faithful religious people sometimes can just sort of go through the motions. We go to worship, we practice our spiritual practices out of duty and out of habit, but we don't really expect God to make an appearance. And so Zechariah, you can imagine then his shock and surprise as he's going through his duties. All of a sudden, he looks up and goes, "Well, who are you?" And suddenly a divine moment where God sends the angel Gabriel to him and looks at him and says, "Gabriel, guess what? I have good news for you. Here late in your life, your wife and you are going to conceive a child. His name will be John, and he will be great. He will be great. He will go in the spirit of Elijah, and he will preach and proclaim the good news of the coming of the Messiah that the whole world's been waiting on. And because of his preaching, my people will return to the Lord, and parents' hearts will return to their children. It's going to be a great thing, Zechariah. Are you excited? God has chosen you." And as I was thinking about that, last night I was sitting in the sanctuary thinking about that part of the story, and I was praying, and I remembered back to our "Oh Holy Night." You know, the verse says, "A thrill of hope, a weary world rejoices, for yonder born a new and glorious morn." And what's the next line? "If we fall on our knees," I'm not going to sing it because it's too high. "We fall on our knees and hear the angel voices." So I was thinking, well, I would like to think if I was in the sanctuary and the Gabriel showed up and began to speak to me, that I wouldn't be like Zechariah. I'd fall on my knees. That's what's really, I think, is humorous about this story, and sad too. Here he is, he's in the presence of God, and when the angel shows up, he doesn't fall to his knees and hear the angel's voice. He just goes, "Are you kidding me?" My own translation, "Who wants a baby at 80? Are you, this is my translation. It's like, "Are you sure?" The Message translation really translates it really well and says, "You got to be kidding me. I'll believe it when I see it." And so it was just hard for him to believe. That's what weariness does to us. Even when the presence of God makes God's self known to us in our present moment, we have a hard time believing it, and we have a hard time seeing it. Brene Brown is a sociologist and a great researcher and a great author, and she writes a lot about vulnerability and guilt and shame. She surveys people, and she says this: of all the emotions that we feel and experience in life, that joy may be the most difficult for us as human beings, especially as we get older. Now, when you're like Mary, you remember back in the story, Mary, the angel shows up for Mary, and Mary goes, "Hey, that's great, I'll do it, I'll sign up, I'll go." That's because Mary was just a kid. She didn't know that life was going to disappoint her, right? But as you get older, you're not going to be fooled by joy. Because Brene Brown says that we're suspicious of joy. We want to keep joy at an arm's length because we're worried it won't be enough. That we're worried that the joy won't last. She says, at its best, we're worried that following joy will be disappointment. But at its worst, we expect disaster following joy. I mean, how many people have had that go from the greatest moment in life till the worst moment? I mean, your football team made the playoff, then you played Texas. It was just like that in a moment, right? I don't care what you think. That was funny. But it's true. And so we protect ourselves and we protect our hearts and we keep joy away from us because we don't want to feel anything too much. We're weary. And Brene Brown interviewed this man that she interviewed, and he said that his life strategy, was to plan for the worst and expect the worst and to live that way. Until his wife died unexpectedly and tragically. And he said that preparing for the worst and expecting the worst didn't help me at all to prepare for the worst. In fact, after the worst occurred, I felt even more worse. Because I realized I'd spent my whole life with the person I loved more than anything in the world and could never fully ever enjoy any moment in life because I kept expecting the worst. I hope not to do that. And he said this is what he said. He said, so I've committed myself now for the rest of my life that the way that I'm going to love my wife is I'm going to enjoy every moment that I have and not let a moment go by that I don't look to enjoy. See, that's the thing is about weariness. Weariness is just a part of life. It just happens. But if you let it form a scar tissue over your heart and keep joy at arm's length, you're never going to really fully live this life. Because weariness and joy, they just kind of go together. And joy is even greater in the midst of weariness. And God sort of makes it all happen. And so I guess the question is, how does a weary world rejoice? How do we rejoice when we're weary? Moment by moment. And in this moment, in this moment, in that moment, with God's help. Oh, by the way, if an angel shows up, don't challenge an angel, is what I'm trying to say. Don't say, prove it. I mean, that's a really dumb thing to do. Zechariah goes, hey, well, prove it to me. I'll believe it when I see it. And the angel goes, okay, I'll prove it to you. You're not going to talk for the next 9 months. You know, that'd be really hard for me. I've been on a silent retreat that lasted about 3 minutes, but not 9 months. But I have to believe that in those 9 months of silence, there before God, he was able to see God at work. And so maybe the challenge for us in this Advent season then is to attempt to slow our life down a little bit instead of accelerating it and get quiet, acknowledge our weariness, but then ask God just to show us the way that God works in our lives in the little ways and to nurture gratitude and to just listen. Because God is all around us, everywhere, all the time. And so we just get quiet and listen.